Here we are in chapter number 11, and we're looking at the rigor in qualitative research. And very often when we think about quantitative research, it's very defined, and really examining the rigor of qualitative research takes a very critical eye to really examine how the analysis occurred in the qualitative data. So when we're looking at rigor, we're looking at particular desirable characteristics as far as the process for analyzing the data and the product of the qualitative research. So we're looking at not only what the results were, but how did they get to those results. And we're looking at the adequacy overall and the appropriateness of the method. So was the method of the qualitative research appropriate for the questions that were proposed? And how well was the research truly designed? So those are foundational components that you will be looking at when you are analyzing qualitative research. So with that being said, there are a couple of components that really to key into as far as credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. So what we're looking at is some of those factors that we've already discussed as far as deciding validity and reliability and assuring that the content is based on objectivity versus possibly someone who is doing research who wants to gain the answer that they anticipate. And that would not be objective. That would be considered a bias, very honestly. So when we're examining two components of trustworthiness in qualitative research, one is transparency, that it's very clear how they did the research and that it was very systematic. So it was in a very analytical framework. So again, it's very structured so that the same process was used for all of the analysis, for all of the data, for all of the, scripts, so to speak, if there were interviews, those types of things. So there has to be that consistency that is so important. So when we're looking overall at credibility, we want to see that there was a really persistent method to gather the data, providing that really rich description. So it's not just a yes/no answer. We really need that rich interaction. Really looking at debriefing and negative case analysis, and really connecting the dots and doing triangulation when we're looking at credibility of a particular qualitative study. So there are a number of different aspects to look at. And then when we examine transferability, is it applicable to other situations or other people? And that's one of the key factors to look at. And knowing who the population was will help you as a reader to understand where this information can then be transferred to or applied in evidence-based practice, because you want to make sure that the populations are consistent, are similar before we apply the results in another situation. So also with qualitative study, it's really important that the researchers kind of connect and connect their findings to other research that has been completed, because that will build that strength in the body of the evidence as far as really finding other factors that correlate with their findings, so that elevates the strength as well. So we're looking at dependability, and when we're looking at that, we're looking at the audit trail, making sure that when they're analyzing the data that there are notes, there's recordings, researchers' notes on the process, so it's very clear how the data was analyzed and how the results were really arrived at. So all of those things are important considerations, as well as making sure that the data can be confirmed. So that process of how they did it needs to be able to, one needs to be able to apply it again and get the same type of responses. So really looking at confirming and assuring that it is trustworthy information. So schedules and daily activities are important to show how it moves forward, as well as describing the data collection, how it was done, the methods used, and include personal reflections. Again, to really make the information valid and reliable to that particular population. So when we're looking at the journaling aspect, is really looking at how the investigator writes down his or her expectations and looking if those ideas change and evolve over time. And one thing to key into is if a researcher comes into a study with a preconceived idea of how things should be and don't vary their thoughts, even when the results are the input or the content of the study maybe be contrary of what they initially anticipated. So examining other criteria for trustworthiness is making sure that the researcher is qualified based on training and experience, previous publications, what their philosophical stance may be. So all those factors about the researcher themselves is really important, because when we're looking at qualitative data, it's very easy to kind of gauge or imply our own perspectives, and it's important to have that very objective eye and knowing that the researcher is experienced in taking that step back and applying objectivity when analyzing the data. So again, just recapping, we're looking at the methods, we're looking at checking and rechecking data and conclusion, and it's very helpful to have a second researcher to analyze the data as well and see if they are in congruence with their findings. So those are all things to think about as well. So just tying things together as far as issues related to evaluating trustworthiness, really think about the use of quantitative research versus a separate language for qualitative research. So it's two different things. So it's really important to know the two sets of language, so to speak. So looking at how that is done and how the language is used for the difference between quantitative and qualitative criteria is really important, because qualitative is much different as far as designing and establishing rigor, and make sure that you know the qualifications of the person who's doing the research. All of those factors come into play when we're evaluating the trustworthiness of a particular qualitative research study. So if you have any questions about that, let me know.